So here we are. This is the last Sunday before Christmas. And I want to look at this holiday and the story around which this holiday is made. Right? In the Gospels, there's 4 Gospels in the Christian scriptures, and only 2 of them mention the birth of Jesus. Right? Matthew and Luke. Right? These are the stories of countless Christmas Eve pageants and candlelight services. But we rarely, if ever, read the genealogy of Jesus, which is at the beginning of Matthew. It doesn't make for very good reading at a Christmas Eve candlelight service. It's kind of like Barack Obama's birth certificate. Only a very small group of people really want to see it. But back in the time when it was written, the people interested in the genealogy of Jesus were the Jews. Right? Of all the Gospels, the book of Matthew was written for a Jewish audience. And the first question a first century Jew would want to know if they were told that someone was the Messiah is he a descendant of King David? Because they knew that the scripture says, out of the house of King David, a Messiah will come. So Matthew is producing a first century birth certificate, so to speak, to show that Jesus is who they say he is. As we know, it doesn't matter how much documentation and verification you show. Some people just won't believe. Now, I have to admit that I had never read this genealogy before this week. I'm just going to put that out there. You know, I skip over the begats in the Bible, right? It's who begat whom, and it's just this long, monotonous list of names that I can't even pronounce, most of them. But let me tell you, in the genealogy in Matthew, there are some real surprises. There are some people in there that you would think Matthew would leave out. Especially if he's trying to prove that Jesus is the Messiah. But it seems Matthew goes out of his way, in fact, to include some pretty shady characters. Now, you have to remember that history in those days was written by hired historians. So kings would pay historians to write the stories of their conquests. The usual approach, as you can imagine, was to emphasize the victories and the heroic acts and people, and to downplay or leave out the debacles, the debauchery, and the defeats. Now, if a king had a son who was an embarrassment, he'd usually be quietly left out of the story. So it's particularly curious that Matthew would include some of the people who he includes. For example, he references 4 women, and 3 out of the 4 were not even Jewish. Very rare. But more than that, most of these women were known among the Jews as being some of the wanton women of the Bible. And what's truly curious about this is that women were usually not even part of the genealogies. Right? If you're trying to prove the credibility of the Messiah, it required tracing the lineage back through the father's line to King David. So why include these women at all? Especially since they're not exactly the kind of women that you would expect a Messiah to be associated with. Let me read a little bit of this. The very first lines in the Christian scriptures say, "This is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, Judah the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar." Now, you might not know who Tamar is if you didn't grow up in church or in a synagogue, but I guarantee you, any first century Jew knew the story of Tamar. Not only was she not Jewish, but she dressed up as a prostitute and tricked her father-in-law, Judah, into sleeping with her. Kind of awkward. It's awkward. Now, this is not somebody who you would necessarily want to emphasize in a genealogy like this, especially because it also implicates Judah, who apparently slept with prostitutes. Then he goes on to include Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Rahab. Now, she has a label attached to her name. You know how certain famous people have labels? Help me out here. There's Attila the, right? There's Alexander the, right? Zorba the, all right? Conan the, all right, I'm just trying to get everybody involved here. And my son's favorite, Jabba the, all right, good. So certain people have labels attached to their names, and do you know what Rahab was called? She was called Rahab the harlot. That's right. Not only was she not an Israelite, but she was a professional prostitute in Jericho. But let's keep going because we're not even close to being done. Next we have Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Now Ruth also did not have a Jewish heritage. However, Ruth is considered a very virtuous person, but you still have to wonder, why include her and not some of the other virtuous women that Matthew clearly left out? I mean, he could have included Sarah, he could have included Rebecca and others, but he left them out and instead included Ruth the Moabite. Then it goes on to name Ruth's son, Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of King David. Right? Here we are. That's who we're looking for. King David. But what does Matthew do? He goes on to say, David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. Whose mother had been Uriah's wife. You know? Even if you don't know anything about the Bible, you have to wonder why Matthew's not only including another woman in the genealogy, but also the name of that woman's former husband. Talk about awkward. Right? That just seems odd. And it's even more surprising if you know the story, right? Who was Uriah's wife? Bathsheba. Right? There's a name that Jewish people knew the story about. In case you don't know the story, David had an affair with his best friend's wife. With his best friend's wife, Bathsheba. Now it gets worse. When he realizes that he's made her pregnant, he has his best friend Uriah killed, and then he steals his wife. Now, this is the absolute worst moment, the greatest moral stain, the biggest embarrassment of David's life. So why does Matthew go out of his way to draw attention to this story when he's trying to justify and build confidence in the lineage of Jesus as the Messiah? It seems like these are unnecessary intrusions, unless, of course, they're the very point of the story. Now, since the entire Christian scriptures begin with this genealogy, maybe it's not irrelevant. Maybe it's not a mistake. Maybe it's the very point of the story. Now, apparently, as Jesus, as it is said, not only came for sinners, he came from sinners. Whether you believe this story literally or figuratively, it is a story of forgiveness in a culture that only knew condemnation. It is a story about the power of grace to break down barriers that separate us. The reason that we celebrate the birthday of Jesus with songs and candles and prayers, the reason that we tell and retell his story year after year and age after age, is that it is the birth of a new consciousness and the beginning of a new conception of human community. One point is that the sins of our past do not have to define our lives. Indeed, from intensely flawed people comes a great light. Jesus' story is nothing if it's not a proclamation that we are and can be forgiven, no matter what we have done. Regardless of the stains on our record and the problems of our past and our present, we can be and are meant to be bearers of a divine life. But it's not so much forgiveness from something as it is forgiveness for something. There's a purpose that redeems our lives and a reason that Matthew includes all of these people in his genealogy. The first lines of the first paragraph of the first chapter of the Christian scriptures emphasizes that it's not just Jews, but it's people of many faiths and nations and groups. It's not just men, but women. It's not just people with good pedigrees, or the wealthy, or the saints, or those who live lives of moral perfection. Everyone has a part to play in redeeming this world. No matter what we have done in our past, we can be and must be a bearer of love and light in this world. It's not so much forgiveness from something as it is forgiveness for a purpose. And a big part of that purpose is breaking down the tribal attitudes of superiority that plague the human condition, that keep us from truly being brothers and sisters on this earth. Being in Oklahoma, I certainly have a very positive idea of tribes. However, that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about tribalism. Tribalism is a strong cultural or ethnic identity that separates one member of a group from the members of another group. It involves attitudes of superiority over others, and it engenders fear and prejudice. Now, I understand it's evolutionary, that there were different times in history when it was really necessary to have this clarity around who's in, who's out, and there's ways in which human societies had to draw certain lines and barriers in order to survive, or at least they felt they did. But this kind of in-group and out-group tribalism can be seen throughout the history of every society, and it is a huge part of the Bible stories in the Hebrew Scriptures. Israelites did not eat with Gentiles. They did not intermarry with Gentiles. They rarely interacted with Gentiles. Jesus came to say, how can one be fully human if one remains divided from other humans based on tribal and ethnic and religious loyalties? Jesus came along to say, there is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male or female, for we are all one in God. Now, he had women among his disciples during his ministry, at his deathbed and after. While Jews looked down on Samaritans, Jesus lifted them up. While people back then stoned adulterers, Jesus showed a way to be forgiven and to begin again. While tax collectors were among the most despised people in that time, in fact, Matthew was a tax collector, if you remember the story, and he became one of Jesus' disciples. Those who were considered untouchable and unclean, Jesus touched, and he treated as fully human, and he even blessed. One of the very first converts to Christianity was an Ethiopian eunuch who was baptized by Philip. Now, back then, anyone who would alter their gender or take a knife to their sexual parts was considered spiritually unclean and unredeemable. And yet, such a person was the first convert to Christianity that is written about in the Scriptures. in Acts chapter 8. Now, in a world consumed by tribalism, as Jesus' world was and ours still is, people's lives become filled with hatred and fear and toxic ideas of superiority. In the first century, Israelites believed that they were the chosen of God and everyone else was not. Jesus came and taught that tribal hatreds and divisions diminish humanity. So each year, we recount the story of the birth of a baby and a star shining above, not just a star for the Jews to see, but for all to see. The Magi who came to witness the birth, they were Gentiles who crossed traditional tribal boundaries to honor the newborn king. Born in a stinking manger, surrounded by the funk of animals, not exactly the bed of kings. These wise men in this highly symbolic story cross traditional boundaries and are drawn to Jesus and a new idea of what it means to be human. Now, Matthew, writing to a Jewish audience, was saying, go beyond the boundaries of your fear and prejudices, and go invite the Gentiles to become a part of the love of God, the love that is God, that is good. There's something about Jesus and his message and his ministry that erases ideas of tribal and ethnic boundaries and that calls people into a greater humanity and into a universal sense of being one human family. It's truly amazing, in fact. The story in the Christian scriptures of the Pentecost, it's a story of the first time that people felt the Spirit of Jesus in them. Right? In the book of Acts chapter 2, it says that this gathering in Jerusalem included Parthians, Medes, Elamites, Mesopotamians, Judeans, Cappadocians, and residents of Pontus and Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, I can't even pronounce all these places, Egypt and parts of Libya, Africa, Rome, Jews, Cretans, and Arabs. That's a pretty impressive worldview for back then. A major point of the entire scriptures is to inspire us to step past our fears and the mores and the laws of our times to break down the barriers of language and tribe and religious differences. It was an invitation to go beyond what had ever been known before in humanity, to embrace a new idea of community. It's not so much that Jesus taught us what God is like, is that he showed us what being human is like, fully human. And by doing so, a new understanding of God was born. It's truly about a love beyond belief, a universal love that knows no barriers of superiority or hatred. In times past, you could hear Christians saying, it's because of those stiff-necked Jews that the kingdom of heaven has not come. Years later in this country, we heard it's those shiftless and lazy blacks who want to be treated like people who are responsible for the deterioration of this nation. More recently, we heard the American family is in decline because some uppity women are advocating for equal rights and equal pay. Today, we can hear people saying the same thing, except now the popular culprit is same-gender loving couples who want marriage equality and equal opportunity. Or it's the supposedly lazy, illegal aliens who are blamed as parasites for many of our problems economically and otherwise. Now, it's interesting how undocumented aliens or undocumented people come here and work some of the hardest, toughest jobs there are, and often work 2 and 3 jobs in order to make ends meet, and yet still get called lazy and parasites. Someone obviously needs what they're offering. Just as American slaves were called the same, lazy and shiftless, right? While they were working hard manual labor, that their owners could not or did not want to do, and they did not pay them wages, and they did not give them appropriate living conditions? Who sounds lazy and shiftless in this story? Slave owners continually raped their female slaves while labeling African men as sexually deviant and dangerous. Part of the plague of tribalism is that we project our faults and our fears onto the people who we consider the other. Across time, even though the victims have differed, the barriers of celebrating our true humanity have been the same. We could tell the story of the mentally ill, African Americans, Jews, left-handed people, gay, lesbian, and transgender people, all of whom have been made to feel the sting of religious and societal rejection. In the Christmas story, we've been given an invitation to step into a new consciousness, to let go of the humanity-robbing ideas of sexism, racism, homophobia, and religious exclusion. These prejudices not only rob those who are the victims, but it also robs those who have the prejudices of their full humanity. Why celebrate the birth of Jesus each year? Because he's the one who crossed every barrier and boundary that stands in the way of a full and enlightened humanity. The God that was born in him was not a heavenly judge. The God whose birth is celebrated in Jesus is a life force that is continually growing in human history through real, everyday people and will not quit until the barriers come down. So why not celebrate Christmas like this? Why not reach out to someone who's different from you? That's a way to honor and to celebrate the legacy and the heritage and the ministry of Jesus. Right? If you're young, reach out to someone who's older. If you're a citizen of the United States, consider reaching out to someone who is not. If you're fortunate to have a lot of money, reach out to somebody who doesn't. If you're a Christian, talk to someone who's a Muslim or a Buddhist or a Jew. Cross the borders and the walls that have been built by fear. This also means reaching out to people who you've labeled, fallen from grace. Do you have a relative who cheated on his wife and destroyed his marriage? Or one who got so hooked on drugs and alcohol and left a wake of familial and financial devastation? Or one who reached across religious or racial lines to marry someone of a different culture or faith, and by doing so has been made to feel like an exile from their own family or their own circle of friends? Or one who's in prison, literal prison, or one of their own making by their own choices? Remember that the story tells us that God uses intensely imperfect people to bring goodness and light into the world. And when you look into the mirror, remember that no matter what you have done, no matter what you have done to this point in your life, you can be and are meant to be a bearer of purpose and light. We are not so much forgiven from something, we are forgiven for something. We are forgiven of our shortcomings, felonies, and petty misdemeanors in order that we might help build a new consciousness, a new kind of kingdom, a world of peace and goodwill for all. Just as Tamar and Ruth and Bathsheba and Rahab and Judah and David, you're not just an odd and unlikely intrusion into this ancient story. No, in fact, like them, you are the point of the story. God bless you. Merry Christmas. Amen.